The Psychology of Murder by Casey Lytle. Episode number 5, The Socialization of the Mass Shooter. In Chapter 7 of the book this series is based on, The Psychology of Murder, I covered mass murder and mass shooter with a pretty broad umbrella. In this episode, we're going to narrow that focus into a specific area. Specifically, how has publicity over mass shootings in the last 2 decades brought us across an unfortunate threshold where behavior that was once considered an anomaly has socialized into an anticipated norm. Specifically, how has the public perception of what counts as a mass shooter or the traits a mass shooter has, how has that impacted people, the perception of people who display those traits? And is there a way we can roll back from that? Is there a solution to that? But first, we kind of need to back up and establish the path we're heading down. First of all, mass shooting or mass murder isn't defined by specific characteristics of the assailant, but simply by the number of victims. And you get some kind of semantic nitpicking here as far as whether it requires 3 or 4, but in general, for our purposes, a mass shooter has 4 or more victims in a single event, which means people injured by the shooting. Mass murder requires 4 or more deaths in a single event, not including the assailant themselves. If they take their own lives, their number is not included in that. Now, school shooting is just a subset of mass shooting defined by whether or not it occurs on school property. And this is where we have to address our stereotypes on this and essentially the fear that some people have around letting their kids go to a school because of the publicity around these. What do we think of when we think of school shooter? We primarily think of a case in which students are present and students are being targeted. But what is the actual criteria for something becoming a school shooting statistic? It is actually much more broad than that. In its loosest sense, it is simply firing a weapon on school property. It doesn't require that any people be there at all. For example, someone just driving by an empty school at night, firing shots at a building, that's school shooting. People who meet after hours, a group in a school parking lot, and get into a conflict and shots are fired, that counts technically as a school shooting because it happened on school property. So when we look at the big numbers on number of school shootings or even number of mass shootings, we have to consider how many of those don't fit the stereotype we think of, in which people are targeted and people die from it. That's a smaller number. Now, are school shootings a new phenomena in the last 20 or 30 years? Is it a generational thing? You see the meme online where people talk about how in my day there were rifles in the back windows of pickup trucks in high school parking lots, and we had no school shootings. What's happened? You had school shootings then too. You just didn't hear about them. In fact, there was only a handful of years, maybe 3 or 4 years out of the last 120 years, in which there were no recorded school shootings. There was an increase in the number in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. We saw a big bump start in the 90s. So why was that? Why did we have an escalation that started in the 90s? There's a number of factors there. Again, I address several of them in the book. We're not going to go too long into those here because we're heading towards something more specific. But one of the considerations is the glamorization of weapons, especially more powerful weapons, in media, in movies and TV. Where you saw them represented more, especially higher power weapons becoming associated with norms of masculinity. We had the politicizing of guns, which really wasn't present before that. 50 years ago, In rural areas especially, guns were very common in households. They were practically just an appliance. A lot of rural homes, you'd have on a rack in a bedroom or somewhere, you'd have a hunting rifle. You probably have a pistol for home protection that you'd have in a drawer somewhere. And you probably, for protecting your property, had a shotgun. That was the most common and most popular weapon for protecting your property, because when it fires shot, it fires broadly. You don't have to aim as much. What added to the politicizing of it was the assault weapons ban from 1994 to 2004. That's when we started to see the shift of weapons seen as representing freedom. And that's where you got people shouting the Second Amendment. Again, 50, 60 years ago, no one was waving their guns around, shouting Second Amendment or a symbol of freedom. It was the 90s that started to happen. So we had the politicizing of the weapons as well, coinciding with that media effect, glamorizing the weapons in media. But the real kind of tipping point that led to where we're at today was the Columbine shootings in 1999, Klebold and Harris. How did they change it? How did that shooting change things? Well, it was prior to that very rare for school shootings to get national media coverage. Again, I said school shootings have occurred throughout the last 120 years. Why did you never hear about it? Because they weren't covered nationally. A school shooting will get local attention. It might have gotten regional attention, but it's very unlikely it would have been picked up by national media. Again, in those previous decades, there wasn't a lot of time given to national media coverage. It had to be a pretty big event, such as the Texas Tower shooting in the 60s. That one got national attention, but for a brief period of time, because we didn't have the 24/7 cable news cycle then. We didn't have more airtime to fill with national news. It was also so rare, it was almost non-existent prior to Columbine, that shooters would be seeking publicity. It was usually a venting event that with no thought of getting any sort of publicity afterward. Columbine was the first major shooting of the modern era of 24/7 mass media and news media. The first one to really get obsessive coverage that extended for a period of time, much longer than previous national media outlets would have given it. So it was much more common after Columbine for a shooter to be aware of the publicity they would get, and in some cases be seeking that attention. The other one is that mass shootings are still a minority of all the murders every year, but they are the ones that get the most attention. So we tend to think they are more common than they are, and that they are a bigger percentage. When we talk about school shootings, you have to take into account the number of schools in the country, the number of total students that are attending both public and private schools in the country. If you look at the number of students who die in school shootings each year, statistically, schools are still the safest public places you leave your children during the day. Children are much more likely to be killed by family or in car accidents than to die in school. Children are at greater risk in the home or in the car on the way to school than they are at the school. Does that mean we should dismiss the importance of threat to the school and school shootings? No, we should still be doing whatever we can to ensure the safety of that environment. We don't need to blow it off. But at the same token, we don't need to become so frightened by the media reports of these that we want to pull our kids out of school. There's a double whammy here in that if you are so frightened by the school environment, you pull kids out of school, you are actually creating stress on the home environment by doing that. And again, the home environment is a more dangerous environment for a lot of kids than the school environment is. So you may actually be increasing risk rather than reducing it. One of the first shootings that we saw as a direct effect from Columbine was the Virginia Tech shooting, one of the most deadly. It might still stand as the most deadly in U.S. history. That shooter intentionally sought publicity. He knew he was going to get national media attention. In fact, he recorded videos specifically for that purpose. And in between his shooting episodes, from when it began to when it ended, he went to a post office and sent his videos to a media outlet. He even referred specifically in one of his videos to Klebold and Harris as martyrs. So they had created a template that he used as his, as a way to label himself and as an indicator of what his options were given his internal emotional state and his perceptions of his environment. The 2018 Toronto van attack by Alec Manassian, in which he killed several people. He actually praised Elliot Rodger, the Santa Barbara shooter, as the supreme gentleman. So what we've seen here is that mass shooting, as it's represented in media, does not just set a template where these people with the similar traits can self-label and interpret themselves, but these shooters become role models for them as well. What has happened over the years is the media attention of these attacks has created a public profile expectation of the traits of a potential shooter. And you see this mentioned sometimes when people will refer to someone and say they've got mass shooter vibes or they've got school shooter vibes. 40, 50 years ago, there would be no such template in which to judge people. But today we have it. The stereotype of the loner, someone who is socially isolated with few friends or little or no family support. The perception of being rejected by society or specific groups. I emphasize perception here because from the outside, they may not seem to be rejected, but it's their personal perception of that, their perception of being looked down upon by others. All of those things are present in a lot of people, but the key point here that sends them in this spiral toward possible homicidal behavior is suicidal ideation. The point at which they start to think they may take their own lives or want to take their own lives. Now, there's a specific variant in here we have to discuss in that they may go into the event with the intent to take their own lives, but end up not doing it for whatever reason. For some, they may think their attempt is going to end in a exciting movie and TV blaze of gunfire, exchanging gunfire with police or with armed citizens, and don't get that option. Some may go in thinking they're going to take their lives in the end and then just can't manage to do it in the end, can't bring themselves to that point. There's also the issue of whether the fantasy that they've created in their head of what they're going to do, how they imagine the event is going to play out, whether that matches the reality of what they're doing. And this is true across a lot of these cases, even with potential, people heading toward a serial killer profile who have that fantasy. In fantasy, you control every element of it, and you can stop fantasizing it at any time, and there is no consequence to the fantasy. Again, in general, we cannot judge someone's potential behavior based on what they fantasize, because again, fantasy is completely controlled. It's easy for people to have taboo fantasies that they would never carry out, but internally it's a safe environment. If the event does not match the fantasy, that can actually cause them mental distress to the point, all the way to possible psychotic break, to the point of just stopping and not carrying it on, not being able to carry on. An example there is the Colorado theater shooter, James Holmes. He stopped his attack when he still had plenty of available victims. He still had ammunition. The fantasy of what he was about to do or what he was doing did not fit the reality. Once he saw the reality of what he was doing, he had a complete break, and he just stopped, went out back, waited for police to show up, and even warned them that he had booby-trapped his apartment. Did not fit the reality. You take a more recent case, Brian Kohberger, the Idaho killer of the 4 students at the University of Idaho. His fantasy probably did match the reality because he continued on to the second room. If in that first room what he did not fit the fantasy he had, if it had shocked him or disturbed him, he would not have gone on to the second room. He would have stopped and left. All of these traits that we have publicly of the profile of a shooter serves as a public template, not just for us to judge others based on the external traits we perceive, but for people who are experiencing those feelings and traits to interpret their feelings, perceive themselves, and self-label themselves. So if someone has those traits and is at the point of suicidal ideation, it sets an acceptable template for venting that frustration. If I'm going out, I'm taking people with me, and the people I'm going to take with me represent the target of my frustration. It could be individuals. It could be a unique group within their social experience. It could be a broad demographic. They just want to hit back at society and hurt society. The idea that they have been invisible, no one respects them, no one notices them. Well, based on the role models you have of previous shooters, you know you will be infamous. People will know your name. This is a template that didn't exist 50 years ago. It wasn't something that would enter someone's mind, that they would have this option to do this, that other people before you have done it, or that you would get the attention. Again, that's what we mean by these traits being socialized. We hear about them, we learn them, they enter our lexicon when it comes to how we talk about people and how we interpret people. The idea that I can hurt the people who hurt me, or I can hurt the system that hurt me, or I will be remembered and honored by others like me, that they will put me up there with Klebold and Harris, or with Elliot Rodger, or with any of the others. A fairly recent example of this socialization is Orlando Harris, 19-year-old in St. Louis, Missouri, carried out shooting at the Central Visual and Performing Arts High School there. He left a note in his vehicle that said, "I don't have any friends, I don't have any family, I've never had a girlfriend, I've never had a social life. The perfect storm for a mass shooter." Again, 40 or 50 years ago, someone with all of these feelings would not have labeled their feelings and behavior as that of someone who was going to commit homicide. But today, the format is there. The socialization is there. The expectation is there. The socialized mass shooter template led him to the self-perception that he was in that mass shooter category, that he was up there with those other people. Is there a solution to this? This is why we say it's tragic that it's become socialized, because it's become embedded again in our social lexicon, in the expectations we have. And once something becomes embedded in the culture's awareness, it can be really hard to break. The group who display or subjectively experience the traits, not only do they become stereotyped outwardly, but they will stereotype themselves. We frequently refer to this as stereotype threat, where the very group that is stereotyped will start to buy in to the stereotype. Now, the key trigger here, the key point, is suicidal ideation. So if we're going to look at a prevention point, that's the point to focus in on. Because if that part of it can be treated, interrupted, alleviated, the homicidal part of it can be interrupted and prevented. That's not an easy solution. It's a multi-part solution. And that's where you get the public basically cutting its own feet off, because everyone wants what we call a magic bullet solution, meaning they decide there is one cause to something, therefore there is one solution to it. And anytime we have a social problem like this, a social concern, there are multiple factors playing into it, which means there are multiple avenues of solution, each of which will chip away at part of it. But when people adopt strongly to the idea, I think this is the one thing, they tend to resist and fight back against other attempts. And you get different groups that end up infighting, and ultimately nothing gets done. So I didn't mean this to be a pessimistic view, that there is no solution, but just a way to understand why we've had an escalation in it, why we've had a progression that doesn't seem to be receding. And one of the concerns here is when we look at murder in general, and remember again, mass shooting overall, school shootings specifically, is a small percentage of the murders that happen every year, but the ones that get the most media attention, the ones that draw us to them the most. Even though those are small, since the mid-90s, the murder rate has been in steady decline. It declined pretty well from the 90s up until 2014. It hit a low point in 2014, not just the murder rate, but the number of murders per year. By 2014, hit a low point we hadn't seen since the late 1960s. And keep in mind, when I say the number of murders per year were also declining, this is while the population itself was continuing to increase. So that was kind of incredible that was going on. We did then see a bump in 2015, and we have had some bumps since then. It's been climbing again since then, but still it's nowhere near what it was in the 70s and 80s. Those were horrid decades when it comes to crime in general, and that's another story all to itself as to what was going on in those decades. But we have seen a bump. So even during that decline overall of the number of murders, we were seeing an escalation in the mass shooting and school shooting. Again, even though it's a small percentage. So it's these social factors we look at that we're feeding into that. And again, social factors require social solutions, multiples. It's not hopeless. It's not impossible. It's simply complex and requires people agreeing that, yeah, I think there's one component that may be a primary one, but I'm not going to fight if other components come in, if there are other opportunities to chip away before my issue becomes an opportunity. I don't know if this would have served as being more confusing or shining more of a light on it, but I hope it at least served as some sort of explanation or clarity.